Thank you, Ed, for joining me today. As an executive director, your experience and leadership provide great insight to that can inspire our members as they work towards becoming the next generation of future business leaders. Before we get into the questions, can you tell us a little about yourself, your background, and what your role entails?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me today. Yeah, so my name's Ed Draper. I'm the executive director of the Washington Pulp and Paper Foundation. We're a nonprofit housed at the University of Washington. Prior to this, I graduated from University of Washington. I received a bachelor's of science degree in the major that was called paper science and engineering. And once I graduated with that bachelor's degree, I decided to go back to school and get my master's in paper science and engineering, doing research around absorbency and looking at different plant fibers and how that impacted absorbency. After graduating, I worked in industry for a number of years. I started at a company called Sunoco Products, which is a large packaging company. They actually do quite a bit of food packaging. If you were to go to a grocery store, probably 80% of the packaging in there would be made by Sunoco Products. Where I worked at was a 100% recycle paper mill. So we would take your curbside recycling. We would take recycled materials from box plants or from your Amazon warehouses and take that recycled material and turn that back into packages. So I started off as a process engineer, working, entry level engineering position. I got into a quality position where I started interacting a lot more with customers, working, trying to figure out what their problems were and how can we solve them with our products. So I worked with a number of teams and those aspects, both with customers and with our manufacturing facility. Eventually became a regional quality manager with Sunoco Products. So I ended up becoming the manager for around 13 facilities across the Western region for quality, dealing with large corporate customers like Procter and Gamble, Kimberly-Clark, Georgia Pacific, Philip Morris. So lots of different packaging customers that we worked with, dealing with overall, like how we were providing, our services to customers, how our individual products were working for them, where we're meeting their sustainability goals. So things that we can help our customers out. So did that for a few years, and I came back to production, to a mill over in Sumner, Washington, where I was a production manager. I was in that role for around 3 years. In that role, I was the manager of 35 union operators at the facility, along with non-union supervisors and engineers. So did that for about a little over 2 years, and then joined a startup that came out of the University of Washington that was called Sustainable Fiber Technology. We were taking agricultural waste, think of wheat straw after they harvest the grain, or corn stover after they harvest the corn, all this agricultural waste and residue. And could we, instead of burning it, which is what most people do, is they'll burn that residue once they're done with it, could we take that residue and actually turn it into new products? So could we turn it into new packaging, fibers for packaging? Could we use it for toilet paper, paper towels, or even some of the chemicals, the polymers inside of it? Could we use that maybe as a food binding agent or something? So we're trying to utilize this waste product and turn them into new products that could be used. And we ended up having a mill in Germany, south of Frankfurt, in a city called Mannheim, that's actually using our technology for a company called SD. And they're using around 20% of wheat straw from France, Eastern France, and they're putting that into their toilet paper, in Germany and France right now. So after being at that company, I ended up being the COO of that company. And then it'll be 2 years in December. Our executive director had retired, and I had people at the University of Washington reach out asking if I wanted to come back to the University of Washington and become the director of this foundation.
That is incredible. I did some research beforehand to see after meeting you, and I didn't realize that that's all you've done. That's really incredible.
Thank
So,
you.
moving on to our first question. Throughout your career, from working in the pulp and paper industry to now leading the Washington Pulp and Paper Foundation, what leadership qualities have you found most essential in driving innovation and growth with technical industries?
Yeah, so when I look at leadership, I really think of there's two different aspects of leadership. And what I learned throughout my experience is that the type of what you are as a leader and how you project yourself as a leader is going to change based on the circumstances. So there are going to be times where the best way to be a leader is to work with a large group of people, create a consensus, create buy-in, make sure you're incorporating different people's ideas because a lot of times when you have a large team, you're going to get people that have better ideas than you. And it's great to get their ideas together, get their feedback, challenge you. Especially if you're trying to create something that's going to create overall large change to an organization, it's really good to get the feedback and get the buy-in of your team so then they can help implement that. There's also times though where decisions need to be made, and if you try to bring it up to a consensus, either it won't come to a consensus or you don't have the time to allow that to happen. And as a leader, you have to determine where am I at on that pendulum? Am I in a spot for decision making where it makes the most sense to bring in a large group of people to get that consensus building, to do all that? Or is it better where I need to make that decision right now and implement it and then understand what happens afterwards and then change, you modify it and make it better if it wasn't the right decision. So part of your job as a leader is understand where are you at in that pendulum. I would say for the most part, it's best to always build consensus and work with a team. But there's always going to be times where you may have to, look at that and make your own decision and just go for it. And that's something that's hard to say when you do it or when you not do it. That's something you build over time, and it's good to understand. As that's part of what I've learned with experience is where am I at on that pendulum and when do I utilize each type of leadership?
Advice. I'm actually going to skip forward to question three because I think it actually talks a bit more about what you were just talking about. And the question
Okay.
is, how has your leadership style evolved over the years, and what experiences most influenced the way you lead today?
Yeah, so I would say some of the things that really have impacted how I am as a leader, I think part of it is my background. So my dad was working as a forester, logger, as a log scaler. And so, he was an hourly operator working for Weyerhaeuser for a number of years. And, growing up as a kid, I hear him come back from work and talk about, these new, people came right out of college and thinking that they knew everything and, being these managers, I would just tell people, you need to do this, 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 and this. And my dad would come home and he'd be venting about, these type of managers they had to deal with. And so when I started working, in manufacturing, especially as an entry level engineer, a lot of times, I was put in charge of people were older than my parents, and and in the back of my mind, I always had that thought in there is I don't want these people to go home and basically vent about me the same way that my dad vented about his managers. So I always took that into account whenever I made a lot of managerial decisions. I always wanted to listen. I always wanted to talk to people. Again, like I mentioned, a lot of the ways when you're making decisions, you've got time where you can talk to people and understand what are some of the problems and get their feedback and get their buy-in, the vast majority of the time. And when you do that, those people now feel like they're part of the decision-making process. And when you build that kind of buy-in from people, especially if you're trying to implement some type of change or something that's going to be different, or maybe asking for extra work, the fact that they were allowed to give that buy-in, to give their support means that they're more willing to do it.
Yes, that is great advice. So, moving back to question two, given your background with sustainable fiber technologies, how do you see sustainability shaping the future of business leadership, and what can young leaders do now to prepare for this shift?
So I think around sustainability, it's always going to be a constantly changing idea of what is sustainability. And like you see it like with politics, you see it just with what the consumer sentiment is. The idea of what sustainability is going to be different, and it's going to be different where you go. So as a leader, it's really important to understand that when you talk about sustainability, people are going to view this differently. And part of it is going to be, and the fact that it's going to be changing very quickly from year to year to year to what people, what the customers' expectations are of sustainability. So as a leader, you got to be able to really quickly navigate those, both the differences in opinion and also understanding that things are going to be changing very quickly, and you have to be very quickly adapt to those times.
Moving on to question four, the pulp and paper industry has seen significant transformation. How do you lead teams through change while keeping them motivated and focused on long-term goals?
So the biggest thing, because change is not only important in pulp and paper industry, it happens throughout all of businesses, once you graduate and start working. So like I mentioned, things change a lot. You'll see throughout your career, there's going to be lots of changes that happen day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. But the overall strategy and the overall goals for most companies and corporations remain pretty constant. And what you have to do as a leader is how do I take those big goals that really don't change too often and then allow that to impact what we're doing day to day and to get the buy-in from people. So even though things may change, like I mentioned, day to day, quarter to quarter, the overall way of, we're having to go from point A to point Z, and point Z is kind of the overall goal of the company. How we get there is going to change, but overall, we need to get to point Z. And so you got to be able to navigate those different types of challenges and make sure you inspire the people to understand that if we're all aligned to that same goal, it doesn't matter how we get there. As long as we're all heading toward that same place, we'll be able to achieve that.
I could not have said that better. That was great advice. Moving on to the last question. You have experience in lean manufacturing and Six Sigma. How can students apply the principles of continuous improvement to their personal growth and leadership journey? Also, before you answer this question, could you explain to our listeners what these two principles are?
Yeah. I found these tools to be amazing. I did not know about these tools when I was going to college. It was only afterwards, once I started working, that I was introduced to these tools, and I really understood the impact of what these tools and really, even if you don't fully implement the overall like how you do a lean manufacturing or Six Sigma, even just taking ideas out of that is truly powerful. So what lean manufacturing is, it's basically taking ideas that were created. Actually manufacturing in North America in the early 19th in the early 20th century, incorporating ideas of what Henry Ford was doing as far as, implementing, the well, I can't think of it right now. The manufacturing process where everything's like one right after the other. So allowed us to build things faster. And it took those type of ideas and then also, try to create things to make it more faster, make it more efficient. And those were brought over to Japan shortly after World War II. And one of the companies that really embraced this was Toyota. So Toyota took a lot of these manufacturing ideas and they created what was called the Toyota Production Systems, TPS. And basically what they were trying to do is if whenever you're trying to manufacture something, you're trying to identify what are some of the wastes that are out there. Is it waste of time? Is it waste of materials? Is it, that you're having to create extra steps to create something? How can we make this, shorten this down as much as possible? Because the faster and the more simple the process is, the less mistakes that will be created too. And you can create things much faster. So for years, Toyota always had, was considered one of the highest quality vehicles out there because of they had this lean manufacturing method. So that's one area. That's lean manufacturing. So basically, how do you create things simple? How do you take out all the waste when creating it? Six Sigma now is how do I look at the variation that occurs when I'm manufacturing something? So whenever you do anything, there's always going to be a variation. And, let's say you have to manufacture something that has to be 12 inches in length. Well, when you're making that, in reality, it's going to range from maybe 11 and a half inches to 12 and a half inches. You're always going to have this variation as you're manufacturing something. How can you identify what's causing that large variation? How can we shrink it to get as close as possible to 12 inches with a minimal amount of variation to it? And that's utilizing a lot of statistics. It's trying to go through and understand, what's the root cause? How do I do different types of experimental design to identify what are some of the largest contributors, the biggest variables that causes variation? How can I shrink that? So the biggest thing that I love about these tools is that it really focuses the idea of what really is the problem you're trying to solve. You have to ask the right question first. So many times when you're trying to solve a problem, we identify the wrong problem. Like we're trying, and then when you identify the wrong problem, you end up going down you solve for that wrong problem that has no impact on what you're trying to actually like going back to that example of the 12-inch length product we're trying to make. You identify like what is the actual problem here, and if you go down the wrong path, you still end up with that large variation. You spent all that time on there. So one of the most important things you learn with these problem solving tools is first off identifying what is the actual problem you're trying to solve. And then from once you identify the right problem, now you can start trying to identify what are some of the root causes of it. And you have a methodical way of like, okay, What are some large numbers of variables? And this is where you have a team. You get groups of people together. You identify what are all the potential ways that these variables could impact that length. And then once you identify these huge groups of possible variables, now you're trying to say, using statistics, what ones are actually potentially have an impact on that length variation, doing correlation graphs, doing ANOVA analysis, doing these different types of statistical tools. And then once you identify, okay, these maybe three variables are the ones that have the biggest impact, now you can do a design of experiments that really identify, okay, how can I set these processes up so that way I can get right to that, that target I'm going for with the least amount of variation. And before you do all this, you're utilizing lean manufacturing to remove some of the waste. One of the biggest drivers for variation a lot of times is just going from one crew to another crew on how they manufacture something. So how can you create standard work between the two crews? Making sure they're making things the same way. How do you go about going from one product A to product B? Like, do you do what's called a grade change? Are they doing it the same way, or are they turning different buttons than they should be? So again, it's trying to ensure that we're doing things the same way from crew to crew. And then once you establish that same, work doing the same type of workflow. Now you try to identify what are the variables that really can contribute to that big variation, and then what can we do to minimize that? So it just gives you a tool kit to go about to all those different types of ways of improving your product. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And to the listeners that are watching right now, I highly recommend each and every one of you guys looking up lean manufacturing and Six Sigma if you don't know about it, because I think it's something that not only you can use in the future, but also use like on your life and on yourself to, target those goals that you're trying to accomplish or certain things in your life you want to change. I think that they're very applicable to that.
Yeah,
So yeah,
one example for lean, sorry to interrupt, but one big example was if you look up on YouTube, there's some videos out there that talks about NASCAR teams that change tires. Think about like I don't know if anyone follows, car racing or anything, but when that car pulls in there, that team has to go in there and change the tire out as quickly as possible. And they've identified where like, how can we standardize this to make sure it's being done the same way every single time. And versus like if you and I were trying to change a tire. So that's kind of, think of that as like the original way of how you can change a tire. And after they apply lean, look at what a NASCAR team does. And that's so you can see the before and after effects of using lean manufacturing.
so on behalf of my organization, we truly appreciated you taking the time to speak with us about your experiences. Your thoughts on leadership provide valuable guidance for all of those looking to develop their own leadership skills, and we really appreciate that, Ed. Um, until next time, guys, thank you for watching and bye.
Yeah, thank you.